March 6, 1945, Cologne, Germany. The massive King Tiger tank weighed 70 tons, nearly twice as heavy as an American Sherman. Its frontal armor was so thick that Allied tank crews had nicknamed it the Mobile Fortress. German propaganda had convinced everyone, including their own soldiers, that just one King Tiger could destroy an entire American tank platoon. But on this cold morning in Cologne, as the ancient cathedral spires pierced through the smoke of a dying city, 5 American Sherman tanks were about to shatter that myth forever. The German panzer commanders couldn't believe their eyes when the radio crackled with reports: 5 enemy tanks advancing toward the city center. Just 5, against dozens of their invincible King Tigers positioned throughout the streets. Oberleutnant Hans Müller adjusted his periscope and actually laughed. His crew had been fighting retreating battles for months, but this would be their moment of redemption. 5 Shermans against the most powerful tanks ever built. It would be over in minutes. What happened next would haunt German tank crews for the rest of their lives. Within the first hour, 12 King Tigers sat burning or abandoned in Cologne's rubble-strewn streets. Not from enemy fire, but from mechanical breakdowns, empty fuel tanks, and crews who simply ran. The Americans didn't just win, they obliterated the myth of German technological supremacy so completely that surviving German commanders would spend decades trying to understand how it happened. You see, those 5 Sherman crews had something the Germans didn't expect, something that weighed nothing but proved more powerful than 40 tons of extra armor. But here's what will shock you even more than the battle itself. The reason those King Tigers failed so catastrophically wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. And the American tank commanders knew it would happen before they even engaged. So what did those 5 American crews know about warfare that the Germans, despite all their engineering brilliance and military tradition, had completely missed? You see, those 5 Sherman crews had something the Germans didn't expect. Something that weighed nothing but proved more powerful than 40 tons of extra armor. But here's what will shock you even more than the battle itself. The reason those King Tigers failed so catastrophically wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. And the American tank commanders knew it would happen before they even engaged. So what did those 5 American crews know about warfare that the Germans, despite all their engineering brilliance and military tradition, had completely missed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. March 6, 1945, the ancient city of Cologne sat like a broken crown along the Rhine River. For over 1,000 years, the twin spires of its great cathedral had watched over this German city. Now, those same spires pierced through columns of black smoke that rose from bombed buildings and burning vehicles. The Third Reich was dying. Everyone knew it, though few dared speak the words out loud. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine at multiple points. Soviet armies pressed from the east. The industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, was cut off and surrounded. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler raged in his bunker about wonder weapons that would save the fatherland. But in the streets of Cologne, reality painted a different picture. Refugee families pushed handcarts loaded with their remaining possessions. Old men and young boys in oversized uniforms manned checkpoints with weapons they barely knew how to use. The regular German army units had been ground down by years of fighting on multiple fronts. What remained was a mixture of hardened veterans, terrified teenagers, and foreign volunteers who spoke broken German. The economic situation was catastrophic. Fuel was so scarce that tanks often sat motionless for days, waiting for enough gasoline to move a few miles. Food rations had shrunk to near starvation levels. Even the mighty German war machine, once the terror of Europe, now operated on fumes and desperation. Yet in the tank parks around Cologne, something impressive still remained. Dozens of King Tiger tanks sat in defensive positions throughout the city. These were not ordinary tanks. Each King Tiger weighed 70 tons, nearly as much as a small locomotive. Their frontal armor was 8 inches thick, thicker than a man's hand was wide. Their massive 88mm guns could punch through the armor of any Allied tank at distances over a mile away. The crews who operated these metal giants carried themselves with pride that bordered on arrogance. They had been told repeatedly by their officers and by German propaganda that their tanks were the finest fighting vehicles ever built. American Sherman tanks, they learned in training, were cheap, poorly armored death traps that brave German crews would destroy with ease. Oberleutnant Hans Müller commanded one of these King Tigers. At 24, he was already a veteran of battles in Russia and France. His tank, numbered 312, bore the scars of previous engagements but had never been knocked out of action. Müller's crew consisted of 4 other men: his gunner, Klaus, a precise shooter from Bavaria; his loader, Friedrich, barely 18 but quick with the heavy shells; his driver, Otto, who could coax their temperamental machine through the tightest spaces; and his radio operator, Wilhelm, whose steady voice had guided them through countless battles. That morning, as pale sunlight filtered through the smoky air, Müller stood in his tank's turret and surveyed the defensive positions. His King Tiger was positioned at a street corner that gave him clear lines of fire down 2 main roads leading towards the city center. Other King Tigers occupied similar positions throughout Cologne's medieval street network. The plan was simple: let the Americans come, then destroy them from prepared positions with the superior range and armor of German tanks. The radio in Müller's tank crackled with routine reports from other tank commanders. Fuel levels were low but adequate. Ammunition was sufficient for a day's fighting. Morale remained steady despite the overall military situation. The men still believed in their equipment, even if they had growing doubts about the war itself. Around mid-morning, the first unusual radio transmission cut through the routine chatter. It came from an observation post in a church tower near the western edge of the city. The voice was young, probably a Hitler Youth volunteer with binoculars. "Tank Commander Headquarters, this is Observation Post 7. I see American tanks approaching from the west. Counting 5 tanks total. Repeat, 5 enemy tanks approaching the city." In his turret, Müller almost smiled. 5 tanks. Just 5 Sherman tanks approaching a city defended by dozens of King Tigers. It seemed too easy, almost disappointing. He had hoped for a real battle, something that would test his crew's skills and prove the superiority of German engineering. The radio chattered with responses from other tank commanders. Several veteran crews actually laughed. Someone made a joke about American tanks being so poorly built that only 5 had made it this far without breaking down. Another commander suggested they should let the Americans get closer before opening fire, just to make the fight last a few minutes. But Wilhelm, Müller's radio operator, noticed something strange in the American approach. Unlike previous Allied attacks, these 5 tanks were moving with unusual confidence. They advanced in a loose formation that suggested careful coordination rather than desperate assault. Their speed was steady but not rushed, as if they had all the time in the world. Klaus, the gunner, peered through his gun sight and adjusted the range settings on his cannon. The approaching Sherman tanks were still over a mile away, well within killing range of his 88mm gun. At this distance, his armor-piercing shells would go through a Sherman's frontal armor like a knife through paper. Yet something felt different about this engagement. In Russia and France, American tank attacks had followed predictable patterns. Large formations would advance rapidly, accepting heavy losses to overwhelm German positions through sheer numbers. These 5 tanks moved differently. They paused frequently, seeming to study the terrain and German positions with careful attention. Friedrich, the young loader, voiced what several crew members were thinking. Why only 5 tanks? The Americans usually send 20 or 30 at least. Mueller had no good answer. Intelligence reports suggested that American forces in this sector were well supplied and had plenty of tanks available. Sending just 5 Shermans against prepared German defenses made no tactical sense, unless the Americans knew something the Germans didn't. Otto, the driver, started their engine and let it warm up. The King Tiger's massive power plant rumbled to life with a sound like controlled thunder. Other German tanks throughout the city were doing the same, preparing for what should be a brief and decisive engagement. The cathedral bells of Cologne had not rung for months, silenced by air raids and artillery bombardments. But on this morning, as 5 American Sherman tanks approached the ancient city, an unusual quiet settled over the defensive positions. Even the most experienced German tank crews felt a strange tension they couldn't quite explain. What none of them realized was that those 5 Sherman crews had spent weeks studying German tank tactics, fuel shortages, and crew training problems. American intelligence had identified the exact weaknesses that would turn German technological superiority into a fatal disadvantage. The approaching tanks carried more than armor-piercing shells. They carried knowledge that would shatter German confidence in ways that no amount of armor could prevent. The battle for Cologne was about to begin, but the real shock would not be the clash of metal against metal. It would be the moment when German tank crews discovered that everything they believed about warfare, about their enemies, and about their own invincibility was about to crumble like the bombed buildings around them. The first shot came not from a German gun, but from an American Sherman positioned nearly a mile away. The shell screamed through the morning air and struck the side of King Tiger 205, commanded by Hauptmann Weber. The impact rang like a giant church bell, but the thick armor held. Weber's crew cheered, confident their superior protection would keep them safe. But Weber never got the chance to return fire. As his gunner swung their massive turret toward the American position, black smoke began pouring from their engine compartment. The King Tiger's complex transmission, already strained by months of poor maintenance and low-quality fuel, chose that moment to seize up completely. Within minutes, Weber's 70-ton tank became a 70-ton roadblock. Engine failure, Weber reported over the radio, his voice tight with frustration. "We cannot move. Repeat, Tank 205 is immobilized." 3 blocks away, Mueller watched through his periscope as 2 more King Tigers suffered similar fates. Tank 118 simply stopped moving in the middle of the street, its driver frantically working the controls as the engine died. Tank 094 made it 50 yards before its final drive unit snapped, leaving the massive vehicle tilted at an awkward angle against a pile of rubble. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The American Sherman tanks continued their steady advance. They moved in a pattern that seemed almost casual, yet Mueller noticed they never stayed in one position long enough for the German guns to get accurate range. Each time a King Tiger prepared to fire, the target Sherman would duck behind a building or reverse around a corner. Klaus, Mueller's gunner, finally got a clear shot at one of the approaching Shermans. The 88mm cannon boomed, and the armor-piercing shell streaked toward its target. But the Sherman had already moved. The shell punched a hole through a brick wall where the American tank had been seconds earlier. "They're too fast," Klaus muttered, adjusting his gun sight for another shot. "They move like they know where we're going to shoot." That was closer to the truth than Klaus realized. The American tank crews had studied German defensive tactics for weeks. They knew that King Tigers, despite their powerful guns, took precious seconds to rotate their heavy turrets and reload their large shells. The Americans used those seconds to disappear and reappear somewhere else. More disturbing reports crackled over the German radio network. Tank 302 had run out of fuel while trying to reposition for a better shot. Its crew was now trying to siphon gasoline from a nearby truck, but the Americans were advancing too quickly. Tank 177 had suffered a mechanical breakdown when its overworked engine simply seized up from lack of proper oil. Mueller realized with growing alarm that his defensive line was collapsing without the Americans firing more than a dozen shots. The King Tigers weren't being destroyed by enemy shells. They were being defeated by their own mechanical failures and fuel shortages. The American tanks seemed to understand this weakness perfectly. Instead of engaging in direct gun battles, they maneuvered constantly, forcing the German tanks to burn their precious fuel trying to keep up. Every time a King Tiger moved to a new firing position, it consumed gasoline that could not be replaced. Friedrich, the young loader in Mueller's crew, pointed toward a side street where Tank 231 sat motionless. "Look, Herr Oberleutnant, the crew is abandoning their tank." Through his periscope, Mueller watched in disbelief as 5 German tank crewmen climbed out of their perfectly functional King Tiger and began walking away. Their tank had not been hit. Its armor showed no damage, but something had broken their will to fight. The radio provided the explanation. "This is Tank 231, came a weary voice. "We have no fuel and no spare parts. The engine is overheating and the transmission is failing. We cannot fight a mobile battle with a broken tank." Similar reports flooded the radio network. Experienced tank crews were abandoning vehicles that had cost the German Reich enormous resources to build. The mighty King Tigers, technological marvels that were supposed to dominate any battlefield, sat empty in the streets like expensive monuments to German engineering failure. Meanwhile, the American Sherman tanks demonstrated abilities that German intelligence had never reported. They maintained constant radio contact with each other, coordinating their movements with precision that the scattered German defenders could not match. Most shocking of all was the American logistical support. Even as the battle raged, Mueller could see through his periscope that American fuel trucks and ammunition carriers were following closely behind the advancing tanks. The Shermans never seemed to worry about running out of gasoline or shells because their supply line moved with them. Otto, Mueller's driver, tried to reposition their King Tiger for a better shot, but the engine coughed and nearly stalled. "Fuel is getting low," he reported. "Maybe enough for one more move, then we're stuck wherever we stop." This was the reality that German propaganda had never acknowledged. The King Tigers were magnificent weapons when they worked properly and had adequate fuel and maintenance. But in the chaos of a collapsing military situation, their complexity became a fatal weakness. Every King Tiger needed 10 times more fuel than a Sherman to move the same distance. Every mechanical failure required specialized parts that no longer existed in German supply depots. The American tank crews had studied these weaknesses and built their entire attack plan around exploiting them. They never tried to match the King Tigers in a direct armor versus armor duel. Instead, they forced the German tanks into exactly the kind of mobile battle that their fuel shortages and mechanical problems made impossible. Wilhelm, the radio operator, listened to increasingly desperate reports from other German positions. Tank after tank reported mechanical failures, fuel exhaustion, or crew abandonment. The carefully planned defensive line was crumbling not under American firepower, but under the weight of its own logistical impossibility. Klaus managed one more shot at an American tank, but again, the Sherman had moved before the shell arrived. "It's like they can read our minds," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "Every time we're ready to shoot, they're somewhere else." Mueller began to understand what was happening. The Americans weren't just better supplied than German intelligence had reported. They were better trained, better coordinated, and better informed about German weaknesses. Somehow, American tank crews had learned to fight in ways that turned German technological advantages into disadvantages. The most humiliating moment came when Mueller watched an American Sherman drive past 3 abandoned King Tigers without firing a shot. The German tanks sat empty, their crews having walked away rather than fight a battle they knew they could not win. The Sherman's commander actually waved from his turret, as if acknowledging the German crew's practical decision to preserve their lives. As the morning wore on, the 5 American Sherman tanks controlled more and more of Cologne's streets, not through superior firepower, but through superior preparation and logistics. They had fuel when they needed it, ammunition when they needed it, and mechanical reliability that the German tanks could no longer match. Mueller's own King Tiger still functioned, but he could see the writing on the wall. Around him, the defensive position that was supposed to stop an American advance had collapsed without putting up effective resistance. The myth of German tank superiority was dying in the rubble-strewn streets of an ancient cathedral city, defeated not by enemy shells, but by empty fuel tanks and broken transmissions. The Americans had discovered something that German military doctrine had never considered: that the best tank in the world becomes useless when it cannot move, cannot be supplied, and cannot be maintained. In the Industrial War of 1945, these practical matters counted more than armor thickness or gun caliber. By noon, Mueller's King Tiger was the last German tank still fighting in his sector of Cologne. Around him, the streets told a story that shattered everything he had believed about German military superiority. 12 King Tigers sat abandoned or broken within a 4-block area. Not one had been destroyed by enemy fire. They had simply stopped working or run out of fuel. The moment of complete understanding came when Mueller watched an American Sherman crew perform what should have been impossible. Their tank had taken a glancing hit from a German anti-tank gun and suffered damage to its track. Instead of retreating for repairs, the Sherman simply backed into an alley where an American maintenance truck was waiting. Through his periscope, Mueller watched in stunned silence as American mechanics swarmed over the damaged tank. They had replacement track sections, proper tools, and clearly knew exactly what they were doing. Within 20 minutes, the Sherman was moving again, ready to rejoin the battle. The contrast hit Mueller like a physical blow. His own tank needed minor repairs that would take days to complete if the parts could be found at all. The Americans had turned tank maintenance into a fast, efficient process that kept their vehicles fighting. The Germans had created technological marvels that became helpless when anything went wrong. Klaus, his gunner, lowered his eye from the gun sight and turned to look at Mueller. "Herr Oberleutnant, what are we fighting against? These Americans, they're not what we were told they would be." Mueller had no answer. German training had taught them that American soldiers were soft, poorly trained, and equipped with inferior weapons. The propaganda had painted a picture of enemies who would break and run when faced with superior German technology and fighting spirit. Instead, the American tank crews demonstrated skills that German crews rarely possessed. They communicated constantly with each other, sharing information about German positions and coordinating their attacks with precision. They used their radios not just for orders, but for tactical discussions that helped every crew member understand the bigger picture of the battle. Wilhelm, monitoring the German radio network, reported something even more disturbing. "Sir, I'm hearing American voices on our radio frequencies. They're listening to our communications and they understand German." The implications were terrifying. Not only were the Americans better supplied and better coordinated, they were also better informed. They knew German tactical procedures, understood German radio protocols, and could predict German responses because they had studied German methods in detail. Friedrich, the young loader, spoke the thought that was forming in all their minds. They knew this would happen, didn't they? They knew our tanks would break down and run out of fuel. That's why they only sent 5 tanks against dozens of ours. The truth of those words settled over the crew like a cold fog. The Americans had not made a desperate gamble with 5 tanks against overwhelming German forces. They had made a calculated decision based on accurate intelligence about German weaknesses. They had known that most German tanks would defeat themselves through mechanical failure and fuel shortage. Müller pulled out the small notebook he kept for recording battle observations. His hands shook slightly as he began to write. March 6, 1945. Today I learned that we have been fighting ghosts. The enemy we thought we knew does not exist. The Americans are not weak. They are not poorly trained. They are not inferior. He paused, struggling to find words for what he was witnessing. Through his periscope, he could see American soldiers working with calm efficiency. There was no panic, no confusion, no waste of effort. Every action seemed planned and purposeful. Their tanks may be lighter than ours, Müller continued writing, but they move when needed, shoot when needed, and fight when needed. Our tanks are stronger, but they do not move because we have no fuel. They do not shoot because the engines fail. They do not fight because the crews abandon them. Otto, the driver, had been listening to the engine sounds around them. "Sir, I can hear American engines running constantly, but I haven't heard a German engine start in the last hour. They have fuel. We don't." The simple truth of that observation struck deeper than any propaganda speech Müller had ever heard. Warfare was not about having the best individual weapons. It was about having weapons that work when you need them, fuel to move them where required, and crews trained to use them effectively. Klaus attempted one more shot at an American tank, but the Sherman had already disappeared around a corner. "It's like fighting smoke," he said. "Every time we're ready to engage them, they've moved to a better position." Müller realized that the Americans were fighting with their brains as much as their guns. They had studied German tactics and found the perfect counter for each one. German tanks relied on heavy armor and powerful guns, so the Americans avoided direct confrontation. German crews were trained for formal, predictable battles, so the Americans fought in ways that broke all the rules. The radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. It was Hauptmann Weber, whose tank had been the first to break down. His voice was quiet and thoughtful. "All units, this is Weber. I want to say something that needs to be said. These Americans, they didn't win because they were lucky. They won because they were better prepared than us." The admission hung in the air like smoke from the burning buildings around them. A German tank commander was acknowledging that the enemy had outfought them through superior planning and execution. Weber continued, "Look around you. Our tanks are better built, our guns are more powerful, our armor is thicker. But their tanks are still running and ours are not. They planned for this battle better than we did." Müller added his own thoughts to his notebook. "We were told that German engineering was the best in the world. We were told that American equipment was cheap and poorly made. We were told that German soldiers were superior in training and fighting spirit. Today, I see that we were told many things that were not true." The realization spread through Müller's crew like a slow poison. Everything they had believed about the war, about their enemies, about their own superiority, was based on information that bore no resemblance to reality. Friedrich, barely 18 and experiencing his first real battle, asked the question that would haunt them all. If they lied to us about American tanks, what else did they lie to us about? The answer to that question was too large and too terrible to contemplate fully. If American military capability had been completely misrepresented, then perhaps American industrial strength had been understated as well. If American soldiers were better trained than German propaganda claimed, then perhaps American society was stronger than German leaders admitted. Müller closed his notebook and made a decision that would have been unthinkable that morning. Otto, shut down the engine. Wilhelm, send a message to headquarters. Tell them that King Tiger 312 is withdrawing from the battle due to tactical conditions beyond our control. It was a careful way of saying that they were giving up. Not because their tank was destroyed, not because they were outnumbered, but because they finally understood that they were fighting a battle they could not win with the resources they had been given. As Otto shut down their engine, the King Tiger's massive turret seemed to sag slightly, as if the weight of realization was too much for even its thick armor to bear. Around them, the ancient city of Cologne bore witness to the collapse of myths that had sustained German military confidence for years. The 5 American Sherman tanks had won more than a tactical victory. They had shattered German belief in their own invincibility and revealed truths that German propaganda had worked desperately to hide. The Americans were not just better supplied or luckier, they were better at warfare itself, and no amount of superior technology could overcome that fundamental advantage. September 1947. The train wheezed to a stop at the small station outside Munich, its worn brakes squealing against wheels that had carried thousands of German prisoners home from Allied camps. Müller stepped onto the platform carrying a single canvas bag that held everything he owned. 2.5 years had passed since that morning in Cologne when 5 American tanks had taught him more about warfare than 4 years of German military training. The German he returned to bore little resemblance to the Reich he had left. American and British reconstruction efforts had begun to rebuild the bombed cities, but the work moved slowly. Rubble still lined many streets. Families lived in basements and damaged buildings. Food remained scarce, though no longer at starvation levels. Müller's wife Anna waited for him at the station platform. She looked older, thinner, worn down by years of managing alone while he fought and then spent time in Allied prisoner camps. Their reunion was quiet, almost careful, as if both of them had become different people during their long separation. Walking through the streets of their hometown, Müller carried more than his simple bag. In his mind, he brought back memories of American prisoner camps where German tank crews had been treated better than they had expected. He remembered American guards who spoke decent German and asked thoughtful questions about tank warfare. He recalled American officers who studied German tactics not to mock them, but to understand them. Most surprising of all had been the American military libraries in the prisoner camps. German officers were allowed, even encouraged, to read American books about warfare, logistics, and military organization. Müller had spent months reading about American industrial methods, training systems, and tactical development. The picture that emerged was completely different from what German propaganda had painted. Anna led him to their small apartment in a building that had lost its top 2 floors to bombing. As they climbed the narrow stairs, she told him about life during the final months of the war and the first years of occupation. American soldiers had been firm but fair. They had shared food with hungry German children and helped repair essential services like water and electricity. That evening, as they sat in their tiny kitchen, Anna asked the question Müller had been dreading. What was it really like? The fighting, I mean. The newspapers said our tanks were the best in the world. Müller looked at his wife across their small wooden table. How could he explain that everything they had been told was wrong? How could he describe watching German tank crews abandon perfectly good vehicles because they had no fuel or spare parts? How could he make her understand that American military competence had been hidden behind lies about enemy weakness? The Americans, he began slowly, were not what we expected them to be. He told her about Cologne, choosing his words carefully. He described watching American tank crews coordinate their attacks with radios and tactical skill that German crews rarely possessed. He explained how American logistics had kept 5 tanks supplied and mobile, while dozens of German tanks sat motionless for lack of fuel. Anna listened without interrupting, but Müller could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes. She had endured years of hardship, believing that German sacrifices were meaningful, that German technology was superior, that German victory was possible if only everyone fought hard enough. "You mean we lost because they were better soldiers than us?" she asked finally. Müller nodded. Better trained, better supplied, better organized. They studied how we fought and found ways to beat us at our own game. Over the following weeks, Müller began to see how deeply the truth of German military failure had affected other returning veterans. In the local beer hall, former tank commanders gathered to share stories they couldn't tell their families. Klaus, his old gunner, had returned 3 months earlier with similar experiences from American prisoner camps.
"They showed us their tank factories," Klaus told Müller one evening. "The Americans were building 1 Sherman tank every hour at some facilities. Every hour. We were building maybe 5 King Tigers per week when everything worked perfectly." The numbers revealed the true scope of German miscalculation. American industrial capacity had been vastly underestimated by German intelligence. While German factories struggled to produce small numbers of complex tanks, American factories had perfected the mass production of reliable, effective vehicles. Friedrich, the young loader from Müller's crew, had spent his captivity learning English and reading American technical manuals. He described American training methods that emphasized teamwork and communication over rigid discipline. American tank crews practiced together for months before seeing combat, while German crews were often thrown together with minimal preparation. "They treated tank warfare like a science," Friedrich explained. "Every lesson learned in one battle was shared with crews in training. They studied our tactics and developed specific responses to each one." Müller began to understand that the Battle of Cologne had been decided before the first shot was fired. American planners had known about German fuel shortages, mechanical problems, and training deficiencies. They had designed their attack to exploit these weaknesses rather than challenge German strengths. In the evenings, Müller wrote in the notebook he had started during the war. His entries became a record of hard-learned truths. October 15th, 1947. "Today I met Hauptmann Weber at the train station. He told me about American tank production methods he learned about in prisoner camp. The Americans built simpler tanks, but they built thousands of them. We built complicated tanks, but could not build enough or keep them running." The contrast between German and American approaches extended beyond military hardware. American prisoner camps had been models of efficient organization. Food was adequate, medical care was provided, and educational opportunities were available. German prisoners were treated according to written rules that were actually followed. Müller's own experience in American captivity had included technical discussions with American tank crews who genuinely wanted to understand German engineering. These conversations had revealed that American respect for German technology was real, but Americans had learned to fight wars with systems rather than individual superior weapons. Anna slowly began to understand the implications of what her husband was telling her. So, all those years of rationing, all those speeches about wonder weapons, all those promises of victory, were based on leaders who didn't understand what they were fighting against, Müller finished. By winter, Müller had found work helping to rebuild Munich's damaged infrastructure. American engineers supervised much of the reconstruction, and Müller was surprised by their professionalism and competence. They approached rebuilding with the same systematic efficiency they had brought to warfare. Working alongside American construction supervisors, Müller learned that American success came from institutional knowledge rather than individual brilliance. Systems were designed to work even when individuals made mistakes. Training was thorough and standardized. Equipment was built for reliability rather than maximum performance. On Christmas Eve 1947, Müller made his final entry in the notebook he had kept since Cologne. What I learned in that battle was not just about tanks or tactics. I learned that propaganda can make you blind to your enemy's real strengths. We were told the Americans were weak, so we never prepared for their actual capabilities. He paused, looking at Anna and their small Christmas tree decorated with ornaments made from scraps of metal and paper. Outside, snow was falling on a city slowly healing from the wounds of war. The Americans won because they saw war as a problem to be solved rather than a test of national character. They studied, they planned, they prepared systematically. We believed that courage and superior technology would be enough. Müller closed the notebook and placed it in their small bookshelf next to Anna's cookbook and a few saved novels. The story of 5 American tanks defeating dozens of German ones had become for him a lesson about the danger of believing your own propaganda and the importance of understanding your opponents as they really are. The lesson that viewers should take from this story was clear. In any conflict, victory goes not to those with the best individual weapons or the most passionate beliefs, but to those who best understand reality and prepare most thoroughly for the challenges they will actually face. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.